The Badgers continue momentum on the recruiting front, picking up another football commit. We're going to talk about Eloms, what we like about him, and where he fits in that secondary. Plus, basketball talk. Is this team more athletic than last year's team? Let's talk about it on Wisconsin. Let's go.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Thank you for making this your first listen. This is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ryan Harings, as always. Today's episode, we were talking Carson Eloms, commits to the Badgers football side, cornerback. We're going to get into his game, scout him a little bit. And then thoughts on the basketball team, hit each of the new portal additions, and is this team more athletic than last year's team? We're going to bring Connor Whelan coming on the show, covering them with the Badgers for Badger Wire and USA Today. Connor, thank you for jumping on, man. Let's start here with Carson Eloms, cornerback just today committed to the Badgers out of Indiana, 6 foot, about 180 pounds. What do you like about Eloms? Where does he fit into this defense?
Hey, thanks again for having me. What I like about Eloms, honestly, is the fact that there's a lot of potential to grow, both size-wise and potential-wise. I think the fact that he already has a pretty solid offer list from these bigger Power 5 teams such as Missouri and Indiana, who's obviously did an incredible job last year football-wise, just shows that there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. And maybe don't even look at the 3-star rating because he definitely has the chance to move up and be a high riser in those rankings as he progresses and gets closer to joining us in Madison here.
Yeah, I like with Eloms, I like the the tools to me are there. 6 foot. This is the type of cornerback they've generally gone after. A little longer. If you look at his huddle film, he has a self-reported 4.47 40, 38.5-inch vertical. So the physical tools are there. And then you turn on the film, short area quickness to me was really strong. His ability to drive on routes. I think you see that. You see versatility. He's able to play off ball on a couple clips. He's in, I think he could play slot for you. He's in man press in other clips. So I think there's a lot of physical tools you like there. You mentioned a 3-star. It's kind of a higher 3-star if you look at the composite. And I think that's reflective of the physical tools. And much like Carmelo Reed, who we're going to talk about too, I think the Badgers, you have to get physical tools at these spots and then develop them because you're not going to find the physical guy that is really developed at the corner. That guy's going to Bama. He's going to Ohio State. So I like that they're grabbing guys with good physicality.
Yeah, for sure. I also think that it fits the archetype of the kind of cornerbacks, like you were saying, that Luke Fickell and even Mike Tressel wants. It reminds me of the Sauce Gardners, who are maybe not the huge big bodies like Xavier Lucas might be, who obviously isn't here anymore, but just kind of that guy that can be laterally quick and also make sure that there's not space that's too opened up for receivers, and also basically just be a really good on-ball defender at the same time.
Yep. I agree with all that. And you need to, that's another spot, much like defense line, you got to keep feeding that pipeline. You have to keep adding physical talent there. Let me hit you on Carmelo Reed too. We talked about him on yesterday's show, but I want to get your perspective here. Kind of a big edge that committed to Wisconsin. What were your thoughts watching him on film and when the Badgers grabbed him?
Yeah, for sure. Like you were saying, the sizes, I feel like a great intangible of his, like 6'7", 250. Whether they keep him at kind of D line, if they move him to edge, like we were talking about, either way, he still has the good size that definitely fits the Big Ten mold of a defensive end or even big guy up front. But even like I said earlier, you just look at some of the offers that he has. I feel like that's a good way of, but instead of looking at the recruiting rankings, you can see what programs are interested in. You see a lot of high major programs like LSU, Cincinnati, Michigan State, a lot of programs, Ole Miss, programs that you'd never complain about being in the same competition with. And I feel like he's another guy where the Badgers are getting him at the right time because he reminds me of a guy like Nick Clayton, not in play style, but they have him commit early on, and he can just shoot up the recruiting rankings through his senior year and as the summer goes on. I feel like that's just a great pickup.
Yeah, I think both these players, when you look at Reed and you look at Eloms, both of them have the ability to shoot up the rankings a little bit because, again, that so much of the rankings is upside at the next level, the ability to potentially go on and play in the NFL. And these guys both have the physical type of skills at those spots that evaluators look at. And these are also both plan A targets for the Badgers. That's another thing to consider. These are guys that they've gotten early in the cycle. They've been after them for a while. The Badgers need a couple corners, and they're very clearly completely comfortable getting Eloms on the board quick, even if that might shut it down for someone else down the stretch. So I think you're getting plan A guys with physical tools. I like both these pickups quite a bit. I want to go zoom out a little bit with you. 30,000 foot view, Badgers for football recruiting. You lose Max, earlier on the cycle to USC. potentially a little bit of a slow start, although I don't think it's that far off considering where we're at in the time frame. And then you also lose an in-state offensive lineman to Minnesota. What are your thoughts on Badgers football recruiting right now, just as a whole?
It's a great question. I think the Max Steinecker loss is huge. He was such a big part of recruiting and just getting this energetic feeling about Luke Fickell's vision for Wisconsin. But I do think even the bigger thing is that Wisconsin's never been a program, especially under Fickell, that recruits their biggest guys or makes splashes early in the recruitment. I think about last year when they landed guys or they flipped guys like Jalen Williams and Carter Smith from both from Michigan, actually. Um, and that was very late. That was nearly a couple weeks. That was just a couple weeks before signing day. So I really wouldn't worry too much until it gets closer to the time where recruits start signing and everything. But I do agree it's not nearly the class itself has not come together nearly as quick as some of the other ones we've seen under Coach Fickell. But honestly, at this point, we've seen him hit at Cincinnati on some really great players who were a little under recruited out of high school. Guys like I mentioned earlier, Sauce Gardner, guys like even like Alec Pierce. Some of those guys, I feel like you really just have to kind of trust the process and see what happens, because after a few years, if nothing's really going on, then maybe you can start critiquing. But I feel like Luke Fickell has earned himself enough credit where you give him the benefit of the doubt right now.
Does in-state recruiting matter to you? Because people are all over the map on this. Yes, you got to land in-state kids. No, it doesn't matter where you get guys as long as you get good guys. Does it matter to you?
It depends on the sport. I feel like basketball recently, I see more of I understand more of the gripes because there's been a lot of talent recently, and from the I guess city of Milwaukee and even just smaller Wisconsin towns, and many of them have gone to schools other than Wisconsin. So I can understand the frustration there. But when it comes to football, it really hasn't been the best array of talent in the last couple of years. And I agree that you shouldn't lose the 4 stars out of the state to other programs. But if you're losing it to bigger programs like an Alabama or a Notre Dame, like you can't really complain too much because you just don't know the situation of that kid, because maybe his family had ties there, and maybe Coach Fickell and the rest of their program is targeting other states like Illinois, which is a hotbed for talent. That's basically just as close to Madison as other places in Wisconsin. So I feel like you're not going to ever lose a ton of sleep over losing a guy like Gavin Meyer, who we were talking about earlier. But at the same time, it is a little frustrating. I'm not from the state of Wisconsin, but I can tell fans that want to see the in-state kids thrive, and that's something that I think the Brett Bielema teams and the Barry Alvarez teams pride themselves on, where a lot of the best players were from the state of Wisconsin. That was kind of a hometown kid feel, and you just don't get that as much anymore, both at Wisconsin and just overall in college football and basketball because of NIL and other transfer portal and other factors.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's definitely different. It's a different world we live in, and who knows what Bielema or early Christ or Barry Alvarez, what their hit rate would have been if they were in this NIL era and this transfer portal era where more teams were coming into Wisconsin and it was maybe harder to hang on to those guys. I think ultimately it doesn't matter if you win, right? I mean, I know that's super simplistic. If you get good players and you win, nobody cares. But when you haven't been winning and you've been losing the in-state battles, then people start to wonder, is there a plan? Like what is the master plan here? So I think I think you're dead on. Time will tell, but I think ultimately you got to start winning games. And
that's a great point. But even like you look at some of the Paul Chryst teams, usually his best player was Jonathan Taylor, and he was an out-of-state kid. It just depends on the guys you hit on. Obviously, guys like TJ Watt came in and were a difference maker from honestly day one, but still like that was a very diamond in the rough find. You're not always going to hit on guys like that. So obviously you want a mix of Wisconsin kids, but I will say I think Luke Fickell's done a nice job out of the portal landing some Wisconsin guys that maybe they overlooked out of high school. The biggest one I feel like right now is Matt Young, who was from Neenah and now seems like he's going to be a pretty big contributor for the Badgers this season in that secondary. So I feel like that might be a new thing that happens in college football, where you land a lot of those in-state guys after they developed a couple of years in maybe a smaller school.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't thought about that as much, because that's kind of what Guard did to some degree, to go back and get a Kamari McGee, to go back
Max
and get
Klesmit,
Klesmit for sure. And because here's the thing, I think the in-state guys are less likely when they get to Madison to transfer. I think they're more likely to be high culture guys, and you need those building blocks to build a successful team, but you still got to surround it with talent out of state for sure. We're going to take a quick break there. We're going to come back. We're going to get Connor's take on all 3 news portal basketball players, the construction of this team. Is this team more athletic or just as athletic as last year's team? Because I'm getting a lot of people telling me we need more athletes. I'm not saying you're right or wrong, but I don't know if it's any less athletic than last year's team. We're going to get into all that next. Locked On Badgers. First, a quick second for our friends of the show over at Supply House. Supply House is your number one spot. There's a lot of handy people that listen to this show, that watch this show. I know that because I talk to them. Supply House is your ultimate spot to get all your electrical, your plumbing, everything you need to be that person getting all the DIY jobs done that you need to get done, whether you're doing it for yourself or you're a pro doing it. Supply House has got you covered. Over 200,000 parts. That's about how many basketball players are in the portal. And 400 top brands. You'll find exactly what you need delivered fast and easy, coast to coast. And they have a expert support and industry leading service. So if you are in this professionally, if this is your trade, you're always going to be able to talk to a person, no AI. You're going to talk to somebody real that's going to be able to help you with your order and get you that extra edge with their Trade Master program, exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, discounts on every single order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. Now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM. Start ordering plumbing, HVAC, electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. Okay, let's jump back into this, get Connor back on. Connor, I definitely want to give everyone the opportunity. Where can they find everything that you've got going on, social media, or the articles that you do?
Yeah, for sure. My Twitter is at its_Connor_W. I post all my articles there, and I also tweet a lot of information. But I also cover the Badgers football and basketball mainly at Badgers Wire for USA Today. So that's linked on my profile. So if you want to check that out, it's greatly appreciated.
Let's talk portal news. Let's talk Nick Boyd. I want to start with Nick Boyd. I know he was the last one to officially announce, but I feel like to me, he was the tier A, plan A. You got to get this guy. What were your quick thoughts? Are your quick thoughts on Nick Boyd?
Yeah, I think he brings both a lot of athleticism and experience to the Badgers, which is something like you mentioned earlier, a lot of people are worried about when it came into next year because you're retaining two big, I think, future stars in Blackwell and Nolan Winter, but you do need some more experience, and that's what a guy like John Tanjay brought. And bringing a guy like Nick Boyd, who not only has tournament experience but Final Four experience, is huge. And just you look at the Florida team that just won yesterday. One of their key players was Elijah Martin, who's also on the FAU team. I'm not trying to get ahead of myself, but still, it shows that having that prior Final Four experience is huge for a deep run in March.
And let's get into Andrew Rohde.
Yeah. My father went to UVA, so I'm very familiar with Andrew Rohde. I really liked him the first time he was in the portal. I know he was down to Virginia and Wisconsin, and it really took him a year at UVA to find his footing. He wasn't completely ready for the jump up from St. Thomas to the ACC because he had some issues defensively at first, and he was a little streaky shooting wise. But this past year at Virginia, he was one of the better shooters in the ACC and really good on-ball defender. So I really think he'll be a good starting, I guess, 2 to 3 for the Badgers this year.
Is the shooting real with him? Because I think that's one of the concerns people have had. You mentioned the first year in Virginia, last year career year shooting. Do you think that's real?
Yeah, I think he was taking a little bit too much of a high volume at both St. Thomas and even his first year at Virginia. I think it kind of settled in this year, and I think the fact that he settled into playing well against power opponents shows that he can compete in the Big Ten. And especially, I think his ability to pass and facilitate would be huge out of the kind of the wing spot, which I think would be huge for the Badgers.
Let's hit on the Portland commit. Austin Rapp coming over to help that front court. What are your thoughts on Rapp joining Nolan Winter and that Badgers front court?
He honestly might be my favorite player out of the three, not for the upside for next year, but just the fact that he comes in with 3 years of eligibility remaining is huge. You just don't see guys like that enter the portal and stay at one place. And if he seems like a guy that I feel like he could anchor this front court with Nolan Winter for the next couple of years and then become the lead man himself. And I just love that he's fits the Kirk Penny offense where he takes a lot of threes. He made more threes than Nolan Winter and Stephen Crowell combined last year, but he also is working on a nice post game. And if you look at some of the highlights from last season against the good teams he played like Gonzaga, he started to develop a better game in the paint. And I think that's something that he can work on in Madison, but I think he'll be a good starter here.
Is that, I mean, I've already gone out there and said this. I think that's your starting lineup. It's the 3 portal guys and the 2 returning stars in Winter and Blackwell. Any reason to think that is possibly not your starting lineup next year?
I'd be pretty surprised. I think it's a little bit different than last year where some people may have expected a guy like Cameron Hunter or Xavier Amos to start, but that was just a huge jump up in competition, whereas both Boyd and Rohde have been playing at basically high major competition for the past year, and even Austin Rapp plays in a pretty decent mid-major conference in the Western Conference, Western WCC. I don't even know how to say it, but I do think the potential would be maybe Andrew Rhodey coming off the bench as a sixth man, depending on who the Badgers get as another wing if they're trying to still target that position. I just still think that Rhodey would end up being the starter, but maybe if the other player outshone him later in the year, maybe they could flip-flop roles.
Let me ask you this. What's next, right? What do the Badgers still need to do in the portal? I think you look at that bench for me. I think you look at that bench and you get a little worried. There's a couple pieces there for sure. I think Janicki can play a role. And then you kind of hoping on a Greppy. You're hoping on a Kinzinger. You're hoping maybe on a Garlock. What do they still need to do? How many more bodies do they need to add?
Yeah, I think the two bodies are probably going to add the most or try to look for the most is a stretch four slash kind of wing, taller wing, and also a backup center. I don't know if a guy like Greppy or Will Garlock is ready to take that role yet. And I think a guy like Nolan Winter, who might play stretch four slash stretch five, as well as Austin Rapp, who's probably trending to be the starting center right now, would really benefit from a backup center out of the portal. And it's been very clear that the Badgers have been targeting a lot of those. And it seems like right now their focus is getting a huge big man that can take off some of the weight of guys like Winter and Rapp, as well as a 6'6", 6'7", 3'4", who can shoot well, but also give some quality minutes in reserve.
I'm going to play a little buy or sell with you with some concerns people have sent me with what's happened so far. And I think it's super fair to point out, you hit on it. We've talked about it. The offseason's not over. It is not over. And returning players are going to take jumps. That happens every single year. But given what we know now, a lot of people have asked me, how concerned are we on the glass? I'm going to give you a buy or sell. The Badgers are going to have, I don't want to say major troubles, but they're going to have troubles consistently in the Big Ten on the glass next year.
It's a fair argument. I'm going to sell it just because I think Nolan Winter, when he had to play more of a stretch five role, really shown as a rebounder last year. I don't know if people remember, but against Michigan State and East Lansing last year, he had 17 rebounds. Like
Yeah.
that's a pretty big skill there. And you see like a guy like Austin Rapp, he might not be a 7-footer, but he's close to that, and he still averaged a fair amount of rebounds. I believe it was around 6 or 7 per game. Those two will be pretty solid rebounders. And then you, from 1 to 5, you still have guys like Nick Boyd, who averaged, I believe, 3 or 4 rebounds. Rhodey averaged, I believe, around 3 rebounds, or maybe he was only 2, but still, you still have a lot of guys, even if they're guards, that are rebounding capable. So I feel like that they might not out-rebound a team like Purdue, who just got a big center in Oscar Clough, or even a team like Michigan, who might bring in some bigger bodies. But still, I don't think they're going to get out-rebounded like crazy.
Yeah, I think I'm on the fence with this one, which isn't fair because I gave you a buy or sell. I didn't give you a middle ground. I'm going to buy this a little bit, but I do think you're over. I do really like your overall point because you look at this lineup, it's big. You have a 6'3" guard in Boyd who averaged 3.9 rebounds per game. He's going to help you clean up some of those longer bounces. He's a really good rebounding point guard. Blackwell can be physical. Rhodey's a big guy. You have 2 6'10" to 7-footers on the front court. This is a really big lineup, which I think is going to help you clean some of that up. I still just don't know if we have a dominant guy who will go down there and really clear out space, right? No, and I think against a Michigan State or a Purdue, there could be those sequences where they get 3 offensive rebounds in a row and you just want to rip your hair out.
Yeah, no, it's fair. And I think it honestly comes down to who the Badgers pick up in the portal as their reserves. If they get a guy who's a center, I'll just throw out a name right now. Riley Allensbach from Samford's a guy that's come up a lot. If they get a guy like him who's 6'11", I feel like he could maybe take a little bit of load off rebounding wise. But even if you get a stretch 4 who's like 6'7", who can rebound as well, that will help. But starting lineup wise, I feel pretty good about the rebounding at the moment.
Next buy or sell. This team is not athletic enough.
These are good buy and sells. It makes me think a bit.
And let me before you answer it, I'll say I think the context with which the question is asked is important. Athletic enough to make a deep run into March.
I mean, I'm gonna sell just because I think the athleticism you need is at the guard position, and I really like Max Klesmit as a player. I know his last season was really disappointing, I think, even for him. But bringing in a guy like Nick Boyd just brings a whole different level of athleticism, and that potential lineup of him and Blackwell is very athletic. And I think it's been very clear that guard-dominated teams have been the ones that go deep in March. And I feel like those are the two you need to be athletic. I think it's important to be athletic in the front court, but it's a lot more important to be athletic in the back court. So I'm going to sell that just because I think the athleticism of Boyd and Blackwell can be really important. But I might buy it if Wisconsin, again, doesn't get another kind of athletic wing out of the portal for the reserves, because then if Boyd or Blackwell isn't on the court, it would be a little rough athleticism wise.
Yeah, and it is tough to answer this question right now because more things are going to happen. I think if they add another athlete, to your point, to the bench, I do think I'm going to be in the same boat you are, because I don't think this team is demonstratively less athletic than last year's team. And I think last year's team with a better matchup could have made a run. So like you lose a Tanjay, you lose an Amos, you lose a Klesmit, you lose a Corral, but you get a sophomore to junior jump from Winter. Winter's really athletic as a 4 or a 5. I don't care where you put him for that spot relative. He's really athletic. Boyd is an athletic upgrade over Klesmit. I agree with you there. Blackwell's still Blackwell, and he's going to be a year bigger, stronger, faster. You know, I think there's an athletic ceiling to him, but he's going to be a little better. I think it's maybe a tick better than last year's team, and I thought last year's team was athletic enough to at least push into the Sweet 16.
But even it feels like right now the only player that may be a little less athletic than their last year's starter was Andrew Rohde over John Tanjay. But we don't even know if Andrew Rohde's. I mean, I assume he starts, but what if they get another wing out of the portal? You just don't know yet. But even a guy like Austin Rapp, I feel confident in saying he's more athletic than a guy like Stephen Crowell. I'm not saying he's better, but I feel like he brings more athleticism to the front court than Crowell did last year.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And by the way, athleticism doesn't necessarily mean better, but I do think you get a little more athletic in the front court. You're going to be hurt in other areas, but yeah, I agree with you. We're going to take a quick break there. We're going to come back, final segment, talk a little bit about this starting lineup, how it compares to last year's starting lineup, and if this Kirk Penny system and this new Greg Gard system has helped land some of these recruits. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. First, a quick second for our friends of the show. And as always, a quick second to say thank you for tuning into Locked On Badgers and being an everydayer. Really, really do appreciate y'all. All right, let's come back in with Connor. Let me ask you this, because this is another question I got, and I love this one. Last year's team versus this year's team, assuming these are the starting fives, it's just no bench. Who wins that game?
Good question. I mean, I think that I'd probably say this upcoming year's team, just because I think it is a little more fluid 1 to 5 than last year, because it felt like last year, even when Tanjay or a guy like Blackwell would have an amazing game, you wouldn't always have the best performance from a guy like Stephen Crowell and Max Klesmit. And that's not their fault. It was just you couldn't do as much if you had those two crazy shot makers and playmakers. But it feels like this year it'll be a lot more balanced from 1 to 5. So I do think without the bench, this team would beat the other. But if you added in the bench of last year with a guy like Kamari McGeeney and Carter Gilmore, I give the edge to last year's team.
Yeah, again, this bench is still being built up, but yeah, it's definitely Gilmore and McGee are big losses. I think one of the things people don't talk about enough, and I'm going to give you my answer in a second, but is the potential jump Nolan Winter can take here. Because you're not getting, if next year you get last year's version of Nolan Winter, I'm going to be incredibly disappointed. I don't think you're going to. I think you're going to get a big jump there. I think, like I said, there's possibly a little bit of a jump still there for John Blackwell. I think you bring in a true point guard, which is going to unlock Blackwell even more and unlock the offense. It adds a layer in the pick and roll game that wasn't fully there last year. I think I still go last year's team just because there is a bit of a cheat code in being able to throw the ball into a 7-footer that can pass or score pretty effectively in the post I don't know if this team has. Maybe Winter becomes that. I don't think Rapp does. So I think I go last year's team because I like what Crowell gives you. And obviously you have Tanjay, who's a second team All-American, but I think you can absolutely make the argument that this year's starting five, to your point, is more balanced, more fluid, and maybe harder to defend because you have passing and shooting at every single spot.
That's what I was going to say. I think that if Tanjay's hot, I feel like that team would probably win pretty comfortably just because it's hard to stop a guy that's hot and a guy that also was an All-American. It's just incredible the season he had. But if Tanjay has maybe just a normal day, it feels like this year's upcoming squad might have a better chance just because you're going to have more contributors from 1 to 5 rather than last year where I felt like Tanjay and Blackwell did a bulk of it.
Last year's offense isn't going anywhere. Penny was brought in about a year and a half ago and started to make changes. Last year was more wholesale, but you've still only seen 1 year of this. What's the evolution of this? How does it change with maybe a true point guard without that real kind of pivot in the middle with Crowell? Even though he would pick and pop some, he was in the post most of the time offensively. What does this offense look like with this collection of people in year 2.5 of Penny?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the biggest thing is that it'll unlock Nolan Winter. I think Nolan Winter was very solid last year, but with a guy like Nick Boyd who can find Nolan Winter down low, I think it'll be able to open him up to be a huge jump next year. I think he was really solid this year, and I think he was one of my favorite players to watch on this team because there's just so much potential there. But I do think the fact that he doesn't have to worry about creating his own shot nearly as much means that he'll get better looks from both deep and also in the paint. And I think Nolan Winter started off the year very hot from three, but slowly, I think that the biggest game I'm thinking of is like Northwestern game in the Big Ten tournament, and even the Butler game he had early in December. Those two showed his ability to, I guess, footwork down low. Like he was really flashing some nice moves. And I think with a guy like Nick Boyd and even a guy like Andrew Rohde, who some of the passes you can watch the highlights from UVA, they're pretty incredible. And most of them were nice lobs or nice finds to a guy like Blake Buchanan, who was their center. So if you can get the same thing to Nolan Winter or even Austin Rapp, I think this team is a really high ceiling for next year.
Yeah, I like where you went right there. I think the passing on this team is much better than last year's. I think you brought in Boyd. So losing Crowell hurts a little bit. He was a really good passer, but Boyd and Rhodey are the two best passers on this year's roster or last year's roster. And now you're going to have them both. I think what you could see is, Boyd operating on one side of the court, skipping the ball, and then into like a second-sided Andrew Rhodey, maybe Nolan Winter, two-man game on the other side where the defense is scrambling. You have two elite passers, both can pick and pop. I think this team could put other defenses in a blender, much
And
more
what
so
I
than last
like
year's team.
Yeah, no, what I like too is that you talked about we are losing Crowell's a really good passer, but they're replacing him with Austin Rapp, who's also a very good passer. He's averaged 3+ assists per game. The fact that he's doing that as just a freshman shows the just untapped potential of both him and the squad, because I think last year the ability to pass 1 to 5 was very, I thought every player in the starting lineup was very capable of passing, but I think this year every player in the starting lineup would be like the best passer on another team, which just shows how much potential this offense has.
Yeah, and there's layers to passing, right? Like I think last year's team was skilled. This year's team can unlock different layers because the level of passing has gone up a notch. So now you're talking more cross-court passes, you're talking more pocket passes, you're talking a higher level of offensive efficiency because this team is just a better passing team with spacing. The spacing is still going to be there. I think it's tough. Let me ask you this to finish up the show. We talked a lot about what still needs to happen, maybe some potential bench pieces. Of the bench pieces we know, or I should say, we know in quotes because you never know anymore, but we think are going to be here. Who is in your opinion, the guy that you think could step up? And that's the freshman coming in, Garlock, Hayden Jones, Kinzinger, or a guy like Greppy. Who can step up out of that group?
I mean, the one I want to look at is Zach Kinzinger, and the reason why I say that is because when freshmen come in that Greg Gard has already shown a lot of respect for, I feel like they've done a pretty good job of playing right away, but also just fitting into the system. And we saw that with John Blackwell in 2024. We saw him just have this crazy jump from year one to year two last year. I think a guy like Zach Kinzinger could come in and be, obviously he's not going to be a huge contributor because freshmen aren't usually here, but still he could be a very solid 3-and-D reserve off the bench. And the fact that you can have an in-state guy that might fire the crowd up would be huge. And I stray away from saying a guy like Janicki as the big jump up because I want to see him fit in with this new backcourt and see how he fits with some of the other players that are here, because I'm just curious to see how that works. I feel like Zach Kinzinger is kind of a good plug and play option. I think he probably won't play a ton, but even if he gets like 15 minutes a game, I feel like he'd be a real contributor here.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I'm right there too. And I think a lot of the issues you looked at a Daniel Freitag and some of the issues he had, I think it's definitely wasn't an athletic thing for him. It was, finding his pace in this offense. It was adjusting to this level of competition. Kinzinger is from a balling family. Like his older brother plays, his older brother plays. Like he really gets basketball. He was a role player early on in high school. He guarded the other team's best player. He can shoot the ball. To me, he screams 10 minutes a game as a freshman role player. Come in, play hard, go around screens, space the floor.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure if Daniel Freitag really fit the Kirk Penny system as well as a guy like Zach
Right.
Kinzinger might, because Zach Kinzinger comes in as a guy who big on making his free throws, big on making threes, and even a very solid passer. That's kind of the stuff that Kirk Penny's trying to revitalize this offense with, those kind of three keys. And I don't know if Daniel Freitag brought in that kind of um, systematic fit that a guy like Kinzinger does, because Freitag came in as a very tough bucket getter, but that's sometimes meant mid-rangers, and that's kind of what they're trying to stray away from. So I feel like Kinzinger's fit is a lot better than some of the recruits we've seen, like Daniel Freitag.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I never really thought about Freitag and his fit specifically with this offense. Now, I would say this too. Penny's not going to turn around a physical guard who is getting in the paint, right? Like there's space for that, and Freitag wasn't quite there this year, but it is definitely an interesting point about the fit. We're going to wrap it up there. Go check out Connor's work. Really, really thank you for everybody tuning in. Really fun episode. When you're done here, go check out Locked On NFL Draft with Daniel Parson, Keith Sanchez. They're going to get all your favorite college players to help you kind of break down where they're going to go in the next level. Be the smartest NFL fan over at Locked On NFL Draft. Thank you as always for tuning in to Locked On Badgers. Definitely going to talk to you tomorrow on Wisconsin. Appreciate it.